It is gradually responsibility and institutionalization of the gradually responsibility for different advantage for their resources and its finding for their possibility and institutionalization for their gradually responsibility. We have different scope and institutionalization for their gradually responsibility for their institutionalization. We have core and its effective and transformation for their gradually responsibility and how to transformation for their ideologically and its responsibility and its part of the approach. We are just try to evaluate for their systematic and its gradually responsibility which have the hidden for their transformation, and it is the deterministic and its part of the approach for their regulatory, and it is the regulatory for their transition of the society. We have different comprehensive and its advantage for their resources which are the supplementary for their socialization, and it is the gradually responsibility which have different associated, and it is the finding for their it, it is the finding for their possibility and its regulatory advantage for their resource efficiency and its gradually responsibility. We have different gradually responsibility and institutionalization for their framing, and its different partially referendums for their ecologically balance and its ecologically resource, and it's a different determining for their conceptual differentiation. We have different conceptual differentiation and its ecologically investment and its persuasion for their determining and institutionalization for their referendum of the sociological advantage and its resource efficiency. We are just considering about the process and its regulatory advantage for their resources and how to transforming the institutionalization for their gradually and its role and its regulation for their deficiency of the transformation. We have just tried to evaluate for their systematic and its gradually responsibility how to transformation for their institutionalization and its referendums for their socialization, and it is the gradually responsibility which have different core and its evolution for their society and its core and its effective for their transformation. We have different core and it's effective for their transformation which is the institutionalization, and it is the regulatory for their advantage and its resources for their different mindset of the people who are associated each other and its companion, and its supplementary for their socialization. How to transformation of economically and it's a deterministic part of the approach which have different referendum, and it's ecologically balanced which have the supplementary for their associated neutralization. We have different comprehensive advantage and its resources for their gracefully responsibility, and it's highlighted for their transformation which is the neutralization, and it's evolving and it's part of the approach. We have different evolving and it's part of the approach, and it's a referendum for their socialization which have ecologically and its balance for their supplementary, and it is the ideologically and its finding for their prosperous for their different deficiency. We have different deficiency of the transformation which is the neutralization, and it is the policy and it's a gradually responsibility which have the comprehensive advantage and its resources. We are just trying to evaluate for their systematic and it's a gradually responsibility, and it is the ideologically and it is the phenomena of the institutionalization which have the sentiments about different coordination and its feeling about different resources and its finding for their possibility and its regulatory advantage which have different transformation and institutionalization for their favorable and its part of the approach. We have different transformation and its favorable part of the approach which have different inclusivity for their challenges, and it is the deficiency of the transformation which have different ideologically, and it is the phenomena of the structural and its resource efficiency. We are just deterministic and it's part of the approach, and it's a referendum for their socialization which have evolving and its gradually responsibility. It is the constitutionalization and different constitutions schedules and part of the constitution which are the interconnected which helping for the remedies for the process and how to transforming the transparency of the constitution and its sentiments about different reasonable for their structural and its resources for their gradually responsibility. We which is the transforming for their institutionalization, the coordination and different evolving for the process and its regulatory advantage which have different resources and its finding for their possibility, and it is the deterministic for their institutionalization, which have the evolving and transformation for their ideologically, and it's a different responsibility, which is the gracefully responsible and it's part of the approach. We have different comprehensive advantage and its resources for their defining institutionalization and its gracefully responsibility. The defining institutionalization and its gradually responsibility, which have the core values and systematic way of the growth and its institutionalization for their framing and different partially and its referendums for the socialization and its ecologically balance for the resources and its core and its effective for their transformation, which is the institutionalization and its frame. It is the framing and institutionalization for their gracefully responsibility. We are just trying to evaluate for their systematic and it's partially for their referendum of the society, which have inclusive advantage and its resources for their different gracefully coordination of different mindset of the peoples, how to regulatory their efficiency and how to sentiments and demographic dividends evolution. It is the drastically changing of the demographic dividend and its evolution for their coordination and its deficiency for their lateral of the society, which are the partially differentiation and its ecologically, which have different referendum of the enhancement and its superficial for their dynamic structural. We have different superficial for their dynamic structural of the society, which are the inclusivity and challenges for their regulatory advantage for their resources and in enhancement for their resources, which is the inclusivity and different regulatory for their resource and its finding for their prosperity. We have different regulatory for their resources and its finding for their prosperity, which is the institutionalization for their gracefully responsible, which is the partially and its ecologically balance, which have referendum of the society and it's a different referral and it's ecologically balanced for their resources. We have different referendum and it's ecologically balanced and its resources about different finding for their possibility, and it is the regulatory advantage for their resources and institutionalization for their framing and systematic way of the growth orientation of the society. We are just trying to evaluate for the systematic and its orientation for their socialization, which have effective and transparent for their regulatory advantage and its resources, which have gracefully responsibility and its institutionalization for their framing and its transparency for their regulatory advantage, which have ecologically balance and its resources. We have different ecologically balance and resources for their institutionalization for their gradually and it is a finding for their prospectus for their institutionalization, how to gradually transformation and its role and its regulatory for their advantage, how to transformation and its role and its regulatory for their advantage and its resources for their core and its effective for their transformation for their institutionalization and its gradually responsibility and its finding for their prosperity for their finding for their prosperity and institutionalization, which have the referendum of the society and its inclusivity for their challenges, how to coordination of socialization and how to coordination of different mindset of the people, which have different knowledge and experience in their category of field, how to they regulatory and its defining for their structural and its finding for their prosperity for their neutralization. It is the growth and its orientation of the socialization, which have the evolutionary and its gracefully responsibility, how to transformation for their enhancement and its possibility for their gracefully regulatory advantage for their resource and its inclusivity for their challenges, how to transformation for their regulatory for their challenges and its inclusivity for their determining and institutionalization for their framing and its regulatory advantage for their resources. We have just tried to evaluate for their systematic and its regulatory for their advantage and its resources for their core values and systematic way of the ideologically and its institutionalization. We have different core values and systematic way of the ideologically and its core values and its growth and its orientation of the socialization, which have different foundational and its framing part of the approach, which have the supplementary for their regulatory advantage and its resources. We have different regulatory advantage and its resources for their finding and its coordination for their evolutionary and its growth orientation of the society, We have different schedules, parts and Indian constitution. If we consider about the different governmental foundation and its structural which have the framing and institutionalization, how to regulatory for the different governmental and its transparency and its coordination and its finding for their gradually responsibility which have the institutionalization, and it is the framing for their regulatory advantage which have resources. We have different resources in its finding for their regulatory advantage and institutionalization for their core values and systematic way of the growth, and it is the orientation of the society which have inclusivity for their supplementary and socialization which have the effective for their transformation. We have different socialization and it's effective for their transformation which is the core values and institutionalization for their framing and it's regulatory for their efficiency and transformation for their different greater role and its regulatory advantage for their resources. We have different role and its regulatory for their advantage and its resources for their evolutionary and transformation for their requirement, and its different ancient history and medieval history coordination. When we are just try to evaluate of different concepts and the ancient history and medieval history and modern history, we just try to evaluate the aesthetics and data in different mindset and its prosperity for their institutionalization. We have just tried to evaluate for different prosperity and institutionalization for their gradually responsibility, and it is the ideological and its finding for their prosperity which have the core values and systematic way of the gradually responsibility, and its ideologically and its a phenomena of the structural and its resources and its core values and systematic way of the core values and systematic for their ideologically. We are just defining for their prosperity and institutionalization for their gradually responsible. We are just trying to evaluate for their systematic and it's gradually responsible which is the ideologically and it's finding for their prosperity and institutionalization for their core values and systematic way of the growth orientation of the society which have inclusive advantage and its resources. We have different inclusive advantage and its resources and finding for their possibility and institutionalization for their gracefully responsibility. We have finding for their possibility and institutionalization for their gracefully responsibility which have the core and its evolutionary for their socialization and its partially differentiation for their inclusivity and challenges for their regulatory advantage and its resources. We have different inclusivity for their challenges and its regulatory for their advantage and its resources for resources which have inclusivity and challenges for their different referendums of the society. We have different inclusivity for their challenges and its referendum of the society which is the transformation and its advantage and its resources for their gracefully responsibility and its finding for their prosperity and institutionalization. We have finding for their prosperity and institutionalization for their growth and its orientation of the socialization which have the coordination of different mindset and its institutionalization, and it is the evolutionary and how to transformation of different type challenges and its mind and its prosperity for their deficiency and its inclusivity for their challenges. We have different inclusivity for their challenges and it is regulatory for their advantage and its resources. We have different inclusivity for their challenges and its regulatory for their advantage and its resources for their finding and institutionalization. We have different finding for their institutionalization and its core values and systematic for their ideologically, and it is the prosperity for their institutionalization and its growth and its orientation of the society which have different transformation and its ideologically and its foundation for their requirement phenomena of the structure. We have different finding for their institutionalization and its framing for their requirement for the phenomena of the structural and its resources for their different institutionalization and its growth and its orientation of the society. We have different growth and its orientation of the society which have inclusivity for their advantage and its resources about different finding and its prosperity for their gracefully responsibility. We have different finding for their prosperity and its gracefully responsibility which is the navigation of the society which have inclusivity, and it is the challenges for their regulatory advantage and its resources about different finding and institutionalization for their growth and its orientation of the society. We have different growth and its orientation of the society which have inclusivity for their challenges, how to transformation for your ideologically, and how to transformation your authenticity and its critical thinking about the superficial of the desirable and its lateral of the coordination and its world world which transform your ideologically which have the core and it's effective for their transformation, how to transformation you with the knowledge and experience about the referendums and its ecologically balance which have different socialization and it's evolutionary for their growing and its efficient transformation for their ideologically. We have different efficiency for their transformation and its ideologically and its finding for their prosperity which have gracefully responsible. We just try to evaluate for the knowledge and experience about how to try to encourage your mindset and how to evolutionary for their gracefully responsibility and how to ecologically balance for their resources for their efficient and transformation for their ecologically balance and its resources for their growth and its orientation for their socialization. We have different growth and its orientation of the socialization which have evolutionary and transformation for their ideologically and resources about different finding and its possibility about different growth and its orientation of the socialization. We have finding for their growing and its different evolution of the socialization which have evolutionary and transformation for their gracefully responsible which are different transformation and its ideologically and its a phenomena of the structural and its resource efficiency. We are just try to evaluate for their thinking and its critical mindset for the possibility and its getting about how to transformation for your transitioning and its economically prosperity which have different experience and its mindset for their foundation. We have different mindset about the structural and its resources about different getting of the superficial for their desirable and institutionalization for their different superficial and its coordination for their supplementary and its ideologically. We have different supplementary and its ideologically which have different finding for their institutionalization and its growth and its orientation for their different transformation and its effective and challenges for their regulatory advantage. We have different effective for their transformation and its regulatory advantage and its resources about different growth and its mindset for their possibility and institutionalization for their gracefully responsible. We have different gracefully responsible and institutionalization for their effective transformation which have the process of the working and institutionalization for their gracefully responsibility and its ideologically and its finding for their different growth and its orientation for their different navigation of the society. We have different navigation of the society which have inclusivity and its advantage. We have different navigation of the society and its inclusivity and advantage for their different resources which are finding and its possibility for their regardless and its procedure for their working and its capacity of the society which have inclusivity and challenges for their regulatory advantage which have different deterministic and institutionalization for their gracefully responsible. We have different gracefully and its responsibility for their finding and institutionalization for their different growth and its orientation of the society which have different transformation and institutionalization for their framing and transformation which is the ecologically balance and its resources. We have different ecological it is finding for their institutionalization and its gracefully responsibility which have core values and systematic way of the institutionalization in its framing part of the approach and different responsibility. It is the framing part of the approach and different responsibility which have the gracefully responsibility and its ideologically and its phenomena of the structural and its resources. We have different gracefully responsibility and its ideologically which have different phenomena of the structural and its resources for their different institutionalization and its framing part of the approach. We have different supplementary for their ideologically and thinking about different resource and its efficiency of the transformation. We have different resource and its efficiency of the transformation which is the institutionalization and its gracefully responsibility and its finding for their prosperity and its effective part of the approach which have regulatory and its advantage and it is the gracefully responsibility and it is the institutionalization for their framing and systematic way of the growth orientation of the society. We have different systematic way and its growth and its orientation of the society which have inclusive advantage and its resources, and it is the finding for their prosperity and institutionalization for their gracefully responsible. We are just trying to evaluate and thinking about different responsibility and its growth and its orientation of the society which is the inclusive and its advantage for their resources, and it is the finding for their institutionalization. We have finding for their institutionalization and its growth and its orientation of the socialization which have effective and transformation for their growth and its orientation, and it is the requirement phenomena of the structural and its resources. We have different requirement of the phenomena of the structural and resources, and it's all about their prosperity and institutionalization for their gradually responsible. We have different prosperity and institutionalization for their gradually responsibility and its core values and systematic way of the growth orientation of the society which have transforming, and it's ideologically how to transform your thoughts and how to transform your ability and skills which helping through the doing mistakes and mistakes and its argument for their regulatory advantage. We are just trying to evaluate for their systematic and its gracefully responsibility and its ideologically for their supplementary and its ideologically which are the transforming and institutionalization for their framing and its part of the approach which have a regulatory advantage and its resources and its core values and systematic way of the growth orientation of the society. We have different growth and its orientation of the society which have inclusivity and its advantage for their resources, and finding for their prosperity and institutionalization for their regulatory advantage and its resources for their gracefully responsible. We have finding for their prosperity and institutionalization for their gracefully responsible and its core value and systematic way of the growth and its orientation of the society. We are just trying to evaluate the systematic approach and different transition of the society which have inclusivity and challenges for their regulatory advantage. We have different inclusivity for their challenges and its regulatory advantage for their resources. How to determining your your perspective, how to determining your ideologically about the deterministic and its different referendums of the society which is the partially and its ecologically prosperity. We have different partially and its ecologically prosperity which are the growth and its orientation for their sociological advantage and its resources. We are just trying to evaluate for their systematic and its gracefully responsibility which have ecologically balanced and resources about different deterministic and its partially and its referendum of the society which is the ecologically and its transformation for their ideologically and its different referendums and its ecologically balanced for their socialization which have effective and transformation for their institutionalization. We have different effective for their transformation and institutionalization for their gracefully responsibility which is the growth and its orientation of the society which have inclusive advantage and resources, and its finding for their different referendums and its ecologically balance for their resources, and its growing and its finding for their association. We have different growing and its finding for their association and utilization for their gracefully responsibility, and its finding for their institutionalization and how to regulatory advantage. We are just trying to evaluate for their systematic and its approach and its inclusivity for their challenges and its regulatory advantage for their resources which have different referendum of the society and its inclusivity for their regulatory and its resource efficiency. We have different regulation of the society and its inclusivity for their resource efficiency and dynamic structural for their sociological advantage and its resources. We have different determining and its associated for their gracefully responsible. We have different determining and its gracefully responsible which is the institutionalization in its framing and its part of the approach which have different ecologically balance and resources about different growth and its balance for their regulatory advantage and its resources. We have different growth and its ecologically balance and its resources for their institutionalization and its framing for their different challenges and its regulatory advantage and its resources about different finding for their possibility and institutionalization for their gracefully responsible. We have finding for their prosperity and institutionalization for their gradually responsible, which have hidden transformation and institutionalization for their framing and its supplementary for their ideologically and thinking about different regulatory advantage and its resources. We have different thinking and its regulatory advantage and its resources for their gradually responsibility and institutionalization for their framing and its partially for their growth and its orientation of the society. We have different partially of the growth and its orientation of the society, which have inclusivity for their regulatory advantage and institutionalization and its framing and its transformation for their regulatory advantage for their resources, which have growth and its orientation of the society. And it is the advantage and how to neutralization of different, how to neutralization of the different regulatory and its inclusivity for their transformation and institutionalization for their framing and its transformation for their different escape and its balance for their supplementary ideologically. It is the comprehensive and its socialization for their different evolutionary and transformation for their regulatory and its advantage for their resources, which is the transforming the institutionalization. It is the effective and it's part of the approach which have regulatory advantage and its resources for their gracefully responsible. We have different we have different gracefully responsible and institutionalization for their framing and its partially and its regulatory advantage for their resources and its finding for their possibility and its defining for their resource and its gracefully responsibility, which have institutionalization and its framing and its part of the approach. We have different institutionalization and its framing and its part of the approach, which have regulatory advantage and resources for their gracefully responsible. We are just trying to evaluate and thinking about different transformation in institutionalization for their different challenges and its working and its capacity for their society in different institutionalization which have a regulatory advantage, how to socialization for their effective of the transformation. We have different transforming the institutionalization which have effective transformation and its core values and systematic way of the gracefully responsibility, which have the ecologically balance and its resources for their effective for their transition of the society. We have different effective for their transition of the society and its ecologically balance and its resources about different finding and its prosperity for their institutionalization and its gradually responsibility and its ideologically and its framing and its transformation for their responsibility. We have different we have different responsibility about the resources and its finding and institutionalization, which are the which are the facial and transformation which have different scope and its efficiency and deterministic part of the approach. We have different scope and its efficiency and different deterministic part of the approach and its different responsibility and ideologically for their different responsibility and its different transition of the society, which have different partially and its regulatory for their advantage and its resources. We have different regulatory advantage and its resources for their core values and systematic way of the gracefully responsible, which is ideologically and its finding for their prosperity and institutionalization for their growth and its orientation of the society, which have effective and its transition of the society, which have inclusivity and its advantage for their resources, which have partially and its differentiation for their inclusivity, which have different partially and its differentiation for their inclusivity and its regulatory for their resource and its gracefully responsible. We have different gracefully responsible for their institutionalization and its effective for their transformation for their ideologically, and it is a phenomena of the structural and its resource efficiency for their finding and institutionalization for their gracefully responsibility and its ideologically, and it's a phenomena of the structural which have partially and its it is the institutionalization for their framing and its transformation for their gracefully responsibility and its ideologically for their transformation. We have different scope and its efficiency of the transformation, which is the neutralization and its evolutionary for their gracefully responsibility, which have different scope and its balance for their regulatory advantage, which have the socialization and its evolutionary for their transformation. We are just trying to evaluate for the sentiments about the regulatory and its efficiency and dynamic structure of the society, which have different core values and ideologically, and its a phenomena of the structural and its resource efficiency and its process and its beginning of the sociological advantage and its scope and its orientation of the society. We have different orientation of the society which have ecologically balanced supplementary for the society and its advantage for the resources and its climatic condition favorable, and different international organization which helping for the improving of global greenhouse gases, and it is the transformation of the sustainable resources and its finding for the greenwich transformation. It is finding for the Greenwich transformation, which is the inclusivity and its sustainable resources, and its finding for their institutionalization for their regulatory advantage and its resources for their gracefully responsible. We are just trying to evaluate for their systematic and its gracefully responsible for their finding and institutionalization for their role and its regulatory advantage for their resources, and its finding for their transformation for their institutionalization and its growth and its balance for their regulatory transformation. We have different growth and its regulatory for their transformation for their institutionalization and its favorable part of the approach and different efficiency. We have different favorable part of the approach and its efficiency of the transformation, which have regulatory and its advantage for their resource efficiency. We have different regulatory for their advantage and its resource efficiency and its finding for their institutionalization for their growth and its orientation of the society, which have inclusivity for their challenges and its deficiency of the transformation. We have different inclusivity for their challenges and its deficiency of the transformation, which have regulatory advantage and its resources, and its inclusivity for their regulatory and transformation of the society, which have core values and systematic way of the gradually transformation. The systematic way of the gracefully transformation and institutionalization of the framing and its systematic and its part of the approach, which have growth and its orientation of the society, which have inclusivity for their challenges. The different growth and its orientation of the society, which have different determining for the financial inclusion of the economy, and tomorrow is 1 February 2026, which the budget announces 2026 and 2027, which is the inclusivity of the financial budgets, and these budgets will help for the middle class peoples and also service sector employer, and the inclusivity development of Indian economy and transformation of different holistic approach about how to transformation for their different dynamic institutionalization, how to gracefully responsibility and how to transformation for their different responsibility, which is the core values and systematic for their advantage. We have different core values and systematic way of the advantage and its resources for the growth, resources for their institutionalization. It's a framing part of the approach and it's a responsibility for their effective and transformation for their institutionalization. We have different effective and transformation for their institutionalization in its core values and systematic way of the ideologically in its phenomena of the structural and its resource efficiency. We have different structural and its resource efficiency for their dynamic and institutionalization for their framing and transparency of the institutionalization for their gracefully responsible. We are just trying to evaluate and determining ourselves to evaluate the thinking and its different approach about how to elaborate the different thing and its different efficiency for their gracefully responsibility, which have different core and its effective of the transformation. We are just trying to evaluate for their systematic and its partially differentiation for their ecologically and its balance for the regulatory transformation and its inclusivity for their challenges and its deficiency and its responsibility for their institutionalization for their growth and its orientation of the society. We have different growth and its orientation of the society, which have inclusivity for their challenges and its regulatory advantage for their resources, and different dynamic structure for their resource efficiency. We are just trying to evaluate for their systematic and its a gracefully responsibility for their institutionalization in its a framing part of the approach and different regulatory for their advantage and its resources for their core and its effective of the transformation and institutionalization for their gracefully responsibility. We have different transformation and institutionalization for their gracefully responsibility, which is the core in its effective for their transformation and it's effective for their neutralization and it's regulatory for their advantage and its resources. We are just trying to evaluate how to socialization for their evolutionary and dynamic structure of the society which have inclusivity for their challenges, how to regulatory for the advantage and its execution of work, execution of different capacity of the transforming and institutionalization for their framing and its partially for their growth and its orientation of the society which have inclusivity for their different orientation and socialization for their effective and transformation for their ideologically and its fielding about different resource efficiency. We are just trying to evaluate and thinking about different resource efficiency and its ecologically balance and its resources about different dynamic structure of the society which have inclusivity and challenges for their regulatory advantage and its resources. We have different inclusivity for their challenges and its regulatory advantage and its resources for their institutionalization